Okay, it's rolling there. Just, but look at this when you're talking.
Okay. My name is Art DiMarzio. I was with the 101st Airborne Division, 506 Regiment, 2nd Battalion, Dog Company. I joined the 101st Airborne in England in February in 1944, a few months before D-Day on June the 6th.
Okay.
We jumped in practice, getting ready to make the invasion. We didn't know where we were going to jump or when, but we prepared for that jump, and came D-Day, June the 6th. We jumped early in the morning, about 2:30, 4, 5, 6 hours before the beach forces came in. Our objective was to cut down telephone wires and disrupt communication, which we did, but the pilots of the planes, the C-47s, were also new and not sure of what they were doing. Therefore, they jumped us at a speed faster than they were supposed to, and we were scattered all over Normandy. And I suppose that was to our benefit that happened, because the Germans didn't quite understand or know where we landed and what we were up to. We had an objective, and we didn't get to it until D+3. We were scattered all over Europe, and Normandy in particular.
Art, can you say a couple things here? One is, did you live in Canton, Ohio before you went in the Army?
What was the question again?
Yeah. Did you live in Canton before you went in the Army?
Yes, my home was Canton, Ohio.
And what was your date of birth and your serial number?
My date of birth was April the 22nd, 1925.
And your serial number was?
My serial number was 15140317.
Okay.
I enlisted in about February of 1943. However, they didn't take me until my birthday, till I turned 18. When I turned 18 in April of 43, they sent me a letter, and I had reported to the Army, and they sent me to Camp Wheeler, Georgia for basic training. While we were there, a paratroop officer from Fort Benning, Georgia, came to talk to us about enlisting or volunteering for the Airborne. Me and a friend of mine that was also from Canton, Ohio, stepped out because of the $50 a month extra pay, and he took his physical and failed it. I took my physical and passed it, and he was so disturbed about that he cried. And I asked him, "What are you crying about?" "I got to go to the Airborne." So we went to Fort Benning, Georgia, and took our jump training, and from there we went to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and from there to Virginia, where we boarded ships and went to Ireland. From Ireland, we traveled across Ireland and got on ships again and went over to England, and down through England, and joined the 101st Airborne Division. That's where we started our D-Day training. On the morning that we had boarded the planes to make our jump in Normandy, and prior to that, General Eisenhower came over and visited with us, and we boarded the planes, and there were a few of the airborne that were praying on their knees of what they were getting into, but the most of us didn't really know what we were up against, and it was more like a joke to us, a football game or something like that. But we had traveled around Cherbourg, and then on the way out, going back to England, our red light came on, and we were told to hook up, stand up and hook up. And when the green light came on, we jumped. Because of the fast speed the airplane was traveling, we were scattered all over Normandy. And from that point on, we joined anybody that had an American uniform on. We had little clickers that we used to identify ourselves. We would click once, and if they were an American, they would click twice because it was very dark. And we joined 3 or 4 other soldiers, and some from the 82nd Airborne, and we all scattered and found Germans, and were doing what we had to do to the Germans. And
the lieutenant who was the jump master of your stick was the first man you met on the ground, and before daylight you captured 3 Germans. Would you tell that story?
I had a nickname of Jumbo, and when we landed on the ground, that was on D-Day, we had captured 3 Germans, and I was with a lieutenant, the platoon leader, and jump master he was, and another sergeant, and there was nothing we could do with the Germans. And the lieutenant called us together in a bunch, and he said, Jumbo, he says, you take that one, and we're all laying in a ditch, and I'll take this one, and Sarge, you take that one. And we paired off, and we shot the 3 of them. And from that point on, it was nothing but catching them and shooting them, because we had nothing to do with Germans. And the Germans were deathly afraid of airborne anyway, because of the way we were dressed. Our faces were painted, we had Mohegan haircuts, and they had warned the French people that we were prisoners, civilian prisoners released from jails in the United States to join the airborne, and to be awful careful of the airborne. And from that point on, we made our way to our objective. We heard some people coming down the road, and we jump off to the side of the road into the ditches by the head roads, and 3 Germans were coming up there, and we caught them, and we laid them down in a ditch, and they offered us cigarettes, and they were kind of glad that they were caught. They were laughing and smiling and telling us all us kaput and one thing and another. And that is when the lieutenant asked us to each pick one of them and kill them, because there was just no place to and nowhere to take them.
I think the next thing that happened was in the morning when you came upon that field where the 4 artillery pieces were, and E Company guys under Lieutenant Winters were trying to capture those guns. Can you talk about that a little bit, what you saw when you got there?
About D+2.
Well, that was right on D-Day in the morning after daylight, okay? It was right on D-Day.
Okay, we were ordered to join another company in knocking out some 88s. And a Lieutenant Spears and myself and a couple of other airborne went over to that where the 88s were, and we succeeded in knocking out these 88s, and of course the Germans that were caught there were also killed. We destroyed the 88s, and the tension was so strong that the officer that was there prior to us going there had sat down on the ground and was crying, was actually crying. And of course we went about our business doing what we had to do.
You told me once graphically that the officer put his head down, his helmet fell off, and his blonde hair spilled out, and he was sobbing. Do you remember that? Or?
Yes, this same lieutenant, he was a platoon leader with another company, and he was crying. He put his hands to his face, and his helmet fell off, and he was wiping his face, the tears, and was really upset and distraught over what was going on. He just couldn't take it. The tension was that strong. Probably not because of the 88s that we had just knocked out, but prior to then, the jumping and the scattering of his platoon and one thing and another, he had a lot of pressure put on him. And he wasn't quite sure what he was going to do.
Okay. I don't know if this is the sequence of events, but the incident where this lieutenant had the argument with the sergeant that culminated in him shooting the sergeant. Can you describe what happened then? You were lying on the ground next to the sergeant when it started, right?
D plus 2 or 3, we were ordered to dig in and wait for the beach forces that were coming in to push the Germans toward us, and what we had to do was just kill them as they came toward us. Prior to that, there was an incident where one of our squad leaders was a sergeant. I was a private at that time. Had been drinking, and he had his shirt full of whiskey bottles. And he wanted to go out and meet the Germans, and he was cursing the lieutenant, our platoon leader, that he didn't have the guts to do this. And as he was telling him that, he had reached for his gun, and the lieutenant told him that if you reach for that gun, you better use it. I was laying next to the sergeant that was drunk, and as he reached for his gun, the lieutenant fired a burst of Tommy gun bullets into his chest, breaking bullets or breaking bottles in his shirt. A chaplain came up along with the company commander and talked about what had happened with the lieutenant that did the killing, and they all left. The chaplain said a few words, and we went about our business waiting on the Germans to come up. Nothing more was said about that incident.
Okay. Now you had another one in that same area where some prisoners were lined up in a field, and a sergeant didn't like the fact that they were laughing and joking and shot him in the legs. Can you tell about that?
There was another group of Germans that were caught and laid in a ditch, and another trooper had walked by him and shot them all in the legs, and they were crying, of course, and screaming and yelling. And I, being as young as I was, had fired bullets into their head and killing all the Germans that were in that ditch. It was a horrible sight. Of course, today I can tell you this, eyes popped out and what have you. That was another early incident that happened during D-Day.
Now you said the sergeant shot them in the legs initially because he was unhappy about the fact that they were laughing and joking and seemed to be cocky in captivity there. But after he shot them, he was satisfied and walked completely away from them, right?
he had walked away after he shot him in the legs. He had walked away and didn't even look back at him. And that's when the rest of the incident happened. Either I couldn't stand them crying and one thing and another, but they were destroyed.
Well, in retrospect, you attribute a lot of it to the fact that you were so young and life and death didn't have as much meaning to you then, you said, right?
Most of us were 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, and this type of action in Normandy didn't mean a whole lot to us because it was more like a sport to us. Death never really entered our mind, or what it meant, or understanding that the Germans themselves were sons and fathers and brothers, and we never did care too much about those incidences, and consequently there was a lot of killing going on.
The group you just described, I think you told me they were even a little bit younger than you were. Is that right?
There were a couple that looked younger than we were, but they were 16, 17, 18, 19 years old.
Okay. And it was a day after that, I think, that Captain Gross was killed on that hill. He was your company commander up until then, and you didn't see that, but heard about it, right?
Right. I didn't know Captain Gross that well. He and I had an incident before D-Day. Of course, being young and cocky, he had taken me into his office, company commander's office there, and they showed me a map and had advised me that one day we're going to jump someplace here on the coast of France, and he didn't know where. And he advised me that if I didn't straighten up, that he was going to take my hide and nail it next to the map. That was enough to straighten me out, so I stayed away from him, and I didn't know him that well, but he was killed during the second or third day of the invasion. And another captain had been appointed company commander.
Okay, that's McMillan, right?
That was Captain McMillan.
You pretty much had him the rest of the war as a company commander, right? And everybody thinks real highly of him.
He survived the war, and I was even in touch with him after the war, after we were discharged. We had met a few times and talked about different things.
He was the kind of officer who led from in front in combat, right? He was right in there in the action with you, right?
He exposed himself quite a bit. He was out in front, urging us on and telling us to get going and what have you.
Now, the day when DLC got wounded, you were checking out a farmyard or something there in Normandy. Could you tell that story?
I was called by the platoon leader, which was Lieutenant Spears, and they asked me to go down to this farmhouse, take a couple, 4 or 5 people with me, and check it out and see if there were any Germans down there. We started out towards the farmhouse, and when we got to the farmhouse, the Germans opened fire on us, and this DLC was shot. And one of the other soldiers attempted to pick him up and carry him back to our line, and I told him to leave him there because there was nothing we could do with him anymore, because he was flipping around and groaning and was out of control. And so we went back to our lines, and while we were going, the Germans had come to where we were, where DLC was laying, and bayoneted him, and I think they shot him a couple more times, but in any event, he made it back to our lines. And as far as I know, he's in Pennsylvania somewhere. He has a mental problem or disorder because of that incident.
So he more or less crawled until he found some friendly troops from another unit, and
Right.
they evacuated him.
He crawled out and found some friendly troops that had sent him back to a hospital.
Okay, there was another incident with your lieutenant where you and he were on patrol between the lines, I guess, and you saw some Germans walking toward you with cloth caps on and no weapons, evidently looking to surrender to somebody. Did that happen in Normandy, or was that in Holland where that happened?
That was in Normandy.
Okay, could you tell that
The
one?
same lieutenant, we were on patrol. He always liked to take me on patrol, and why, I don't know. But he saw some Germans coming, and we stepped off to the side. He told us to get into the trees. And as I understand it, when the Germans had their hats off, they were surrendering. And as they got near us, we stepped out, and in German, they was telling us, all is kaput, you know, all is finished, and this lieutenant shot them all down. He just shot them down.
Well, that was, how many of them were in that group?
There were 4 or 5 Germans surrendering, wanted to give up.
You were going to step out and intercept them originally, right? You told me the lieutenant said, shh, shh, no, quiet, quiet, right before they...
Right. He heard them coming, and he told us to step over into the woods until they got close enough, and then he stepped out, and we all stepped out, and they told us in German that all was finished and they wanted to surrender, and he shot them all down.
Yeah, he had no intention of allowing them to surrender.
No. We had nothing to do with them. We couldn't put them anywhere or take them anywhere.
Okay, also in Normandy, you were talking about looting and how the bodies bloated up in the hot weather and everything, and how you were using knives to cut the pockets open on the dead Germans, and the incident with your buddy from California. Can you tell that one?
Yes. Of course, Airborne, we're always looking up for something valuable. We used to catch the Germans and ask them in German, haben Sie Uhr, do you have a watch, or anything else, you know, and we would take their wedding bands. I used to, at one time, had 21 wedding bands on my collar chain, and this one German, dead German, was laying on the ground, and this soldier friend of mine couldn't get his wallet out of his pocket because he had swelled up gangrene that set in, so he took his knife and was trying to cut his pocket open, and he punctured the skin. And I guess a horrible smell was released, and he got pretty upset, and he got up and kicked the German, you know, and he called him a stinking bastard and one thing and another, and he urinated in his mouth.
Okay.
So...
Well, you mentioned when I taped you before about being in some shootouts there in Normandy where you fired your M1 so much that the barrel got red hot and grease was running out of the wood and everything else. Is that did that happen the day when DLC was shot, or was there a lot of days when you fired your weapons that much? You said you also dropped weapons and picked up other weapons. You didn't just stay with the same weapon all the way through. Could you say something about that?
No, we use German weapons. They're Tommy guns. Sometimes we ran out of ammunition, or something happened to our weapons that we're not able to fire anymore, and we would use German Tommy guns and what have you, even some of their hand grenades.
Didn't you get stuck in the leg with a bayonet or something in Normandy? Or
Yes.
how did that one happen?
In Normandy, I was laying on my back, with my head on my helmet, and there were Germans all around us, and I looked back and seen a German coming after me with his gun and bayonet, and I tried to roll out of his way, and he bayoneted me. And I yelled, I grabbed the gun and yelled for some of my friends that was nearby to get him, and they shot him and killed him.
Okay, so you got stuck in the leg on that deal, right?
Right.
Okay.
The bayonet entered my right leg as I was rolling away. He couldn't get a good shot at me. But my friends from my squad brought him down.
Now, were there some other Germans with him on that incident? Or?
Oh, there were Germans everywhere. They were scattered everywhere. We couldn't walk more than 50 yards and we'd run into a bunch of Germans because they had us scattered all over Normandy.
Oh, didn't you say you were eating a K ration or something at the time that incident happened when you were...
You're right. I was eating some K ration with my head on my helmet when I looked back and saw him coming from my rear and tried to roll out of his way, and is when he bayoneted me.
Now, you ran into a lot of German paratroopers in Normandy and also some SS troops. Did you think that they were better soldiers than the other Germans that you saw?
German paratroopers and the SS troopers were a good soldier. Later on during the war, whenever the 101st Airborne would appear someplace, the average German infantryman was definitely afraid of us, and they were not capable of doing battle with us, so the German Airborne would come and battle, try to hold us back or whatever we were doing. SS troops, we could handle them all right. They were afraid of us for what we've done to them, you know. I think at one time the odds were something like 10 to 1. For every American that was killed, there were 10 Germans.
Now, can you repeat what you were saying earlier about the airborne guys, the haircuts, the painted faces, and jumping through the plate glass windows and that type of thing, and screaming and yelling? And
in the Airborne, prior to D-Day, there had been a lot of enlistments by professional athletes, ball players, wrestlers, football players, and what have you. And I've seen them jump through big plate glass windows, screaming and yelling, firing their Tommy guns where there were Germans. And this is one of the reasons why the Germans were deathly afraid of the American paratrooper.
Okay, in Holland, the day of the jump, when you went through Zaan on the way to Eindhoven, did you see those 3 or 4 88s that were by the bridge that they blew up at Zaan? I know they scuttled one of the guns and the other 2 were captured there on the approach to the bridge, and then the Germans blew the bridge up. Were you there when that happened?
No.
Okay. I don't know about any incidents in Holland that I wanted to discuss, but you have a favorite story about an incident at Bastogne where that you were searching a house and found a German hiding in the house. Can you tell that one?
Yes. We were searching houses and again looting, and we had caught a couple of Germans, and I pulled my pistol out and I was going to shoot him, and he got on his knees and he was crying, and the other guys who were with me was telling me, "Go ahead, Jumbo, kill him, kill him, kill him." And I put the gun away and I took my knife and I was going to cut his throat, and he was crying like something you wouldn't believe. And I put my knife away and I took him to the front door and shoved him out there, and there were Germans running up the road surrendering, And I told him to go ahead and join that group, get out of here, you know. And when he got down to the road, he turned around and looked at me and he waved at me. And I told him to get out of here, go, you know. And I don't know if he's alive today or if he remembers the incident. I'm sure he remembers the incident. But whether or not he's alive, I don't know.
Now, by that time in the war, you were a sergeant, weren't you? In Normandy, you were a private, but in Bastogne, were you a squad leader or a platoon sergeant? Or?
Right. I was a platoon sergeant.
And you said these guys that were with you just wanted you to kill the guy for their amusement. It was like a game to them or something. But do you think you were a different person then than you were in Normandy? If that same thing had happened in Normandy, perhaps you would have killed them? Or?
I think as the war progressed, I began to understand death and who those other people were that we were killing. And although in Bastogne there were a lot of Germans killed, there's no question, but we had reserves sent into us at that time, and they had never even seen a German yet. And one incident was that there was a fellow by the name of Mancuso on a machine gun, and he had one of those new guys with him, and this new fellow looked out into the woods and he saw some people in white uniforms and camouflage suits, and he asked Mancuso, he says, "Mancuso, who are those people out there?" Well, Mancuso knew right away who they were because he was a Normandy veteran, and he pushed this guy out of the way and fired his machine gun there, and he was knocking trees down 2-3 inches in diameter. And all the Germans were killed. And another incident, and I don't think I want to mention his name, but we went out one night, it was, the outpost came running in and said, Germans, Germans, Germans. He was new. And I asked him, I said, "What the hell are you doing here? Why aren't you out there?" He said, "Germans, Germans." I said, "Let's get back out there and put you back in that hole." So I took 4 or 5 guys with me. Some of them were new, and we went out to where the foxhole was. His foxhole, about, maybe 50 yards out in front of us. And I told him to get in that hole and don't come out of it. Even if you have to die in it, don't come out of it. So on the way back to our line, there was one of our soldiers lying there, and I looked at him. He was a new fella, first time in combat. I asked him, I says, "What the hell are you doing here?" He says, "Well, I was going to give you cover if the Germans were in there." I said, "You were, huh?" So the next day or so, I took him on a couple of patrols with me. On one day, there was a gap between our right flank and another company's left flank, and I was to go out there and meet with him and ask him to close up that gap. And on the way there were some Germans talking into this woods, and one of our guys thought it was the Americans, and he walked in there, and we had a new lieutenant with us. He was right behind me, and I told him, I says, "If there's any shooting, fire your guns in there and let's get the hell out of here." Well, he said, "Well, Cleaver's in there," and I said, "I don't care who's in there. Shoot. Kill everybody that's in there." Luckily, Cleaver came out of the woods, made a big circle, came back to us and told there was Germans in there. I says, "I know, let's get the hell out of here." So we went back and told our company commander that there were Germans already in that gap.
Now, the town that you were in where the incident happened with the prisoner who you were going to kill and decided not to, was that in the town of Foy? You think that happened in Foy?
I think it was. I think it was.
And You mentioned one time about seeing McMillan running down the street with burlap wrapped around his feet. Was that in Foy also that you saw him with his feet wrapped up? Or?
Yeah, that was in Bastogne. We didn't have any gear, any winter clothing. And we would go into barns and look for burlap sacks to wrap around our feet to keep us warm, because it was around zero, a few degrees below or above, and we had to sleep on those holes. But they were burlap sacks that we wrapped around our feet.
Did you ever get any permanent damage to your feet from being in the cold there? Or?
Well, I don't know. There might be, but I didn't get. If you mean were any of my feet amputated or something like that, no. But there were many that were.
You remember the railroad line in the woods there that was a boundary between you and the 501? You actually talked to them across the tracks a couple times, didn't you?
Yes.
And they said that they didn't believe you were who you said you were. They needed to talk to an officer or something.
Right. They thought we were Germans dressed as Americans. And they wouldn't talk to us unless we brought an officer up to talk to them.
And the guy who told you that, was he an officer himself? Or?
I don't think so. I don't. It was. I think it was night, and he didn't. He wanted us to bring an officer instead of talking to a sergeant.
Now, was there any shooting with you right near the tracks there, or was it mostly farther away from the tracks? Remember?
No, I don't remember.
Well, in Holland, I never found out, but when you were on the dike there in Holland, you jumped on September 17th, and after liberating Eindhoven and going up around Veckel, you went up to the island across the Nijmegen Bridge. And you were dug in along a dike there facing the Nader Rhine, and the Germans were right across the road on the other side of the dike. Do you have any stories about that period, or do you remember that period? Or?
Well, the mission there in Holland, we were to jump on this highway. The 82nd was supposed to jump north of us, and the British Airborne was supposed to jump above them near Nijmegen Bridge, and our mission was to keep that highway open so General Dempsey's 2nd Army could make his run up this highway quickly as possible and get into Germany. And any time that the Germans would cut those roads, we had to go there and open up the road again. But the British fighters are not like the American, especially the Airborne. We would go up to a couple of British tanks and tell them, German tanks are coming, German tanks are coming. They had to call their officer and tell them, my mission, German tanks coming south on Route 232, whatever it was, request permission to fire. If they were American tankers, they would have went up there and just knocked them out. So the difference in fighting was great. But there was a lot of dead Germans up there, and of course, Airborne likes to loot, and we used to loot a lot of those dead Germans, of course. But it was another mission we had. We had to go across the river, and this Lieutenant Spears, or Captain Spears it was, took me along with him. We went across the river, and we were to bring a German prisoner back. And we went up into the woods, and it was night. And before we went across the river in these rubber rafts, our Colonel Sink came down, and he looked at us, camouflaged, and he says, man, would I hate to be a bunch of Germans meet you guys. So we got in rubber rafts and went across the river and up into the woods, and we smelled cigarette smoke, actually. We were pretty close to Germans, but it was so dark that we had to hold our weapons by the barrel, and the guy behind us would hold it by the stock so we could follow each other in the dark. But we weren't able to bring a German prisoner back, but we did hear some walking up the road. But before they got to us, they cut off into the woods. So it was decided we had better go back. So we found our rubber raft, and we got in it and started to paddle across the river, and a couple of flares went up. And we really paddled across that river then and got to the other side safe and sound.
That was just the two of you on that one, right? Just you
No,
and
there
Spears?
was about four of us in that river raft.
Okay, and the one incident, Spears went across by himself, didn't he?
Oh, yeah,
That's when he got shot over there, right?
He would go over by himself, and just kill Germans. Kill Germans.
Oh, he killed them at night when they were
Oh
sleeping.
yeah, he would bring back helmets and weapons and what have you.
Well, the time he got shot, he had to swim across, though, right? He had to leave the raft over there and swim back across.
Right, one time he was shot in the behind, and he left his raft over there and swam across the river.
That's when that Mihawk from S2 dragged him in from the shore for medical attention. How about the night when the British paratroopers were rescued and came across the river there? Were you involved in that at all? Or,
The British paratroopers?
yeah, I think E Company brought them out in the middle of the night on rafts from the other side. Or,
No, that was up around Nijmegen.
yeah.
That was a terrible time up there. I understand that the British lost something like 7,000 out of 9,000 troops. They were really slaughtered up there. We had gone up there, but it was pretty much secured by the time we went up there.
Okay. Now, that incident with the sergeant that was shot by the lieutenant again in Normandy, there was some details about that you told me before that you omitted from here. But you and the sergeant were laying stomach down, facing towards the enemy, and you were to the sergeant's right, and you said that when the lieutenant shot him that the empty shell casings hit you when you were lying on the ground, and you could hear the glass breaking, and you said that the lieutenant told you to remove his binoculars or compass or anything that was still usable, and then
Right.
he went to talk to Captain Gross about it, and the chaplain knelt and said a prayer. Those elements, can you tell them in a narrative fashion on here now, and as if you're just telling the story, and put those details in about how you were lying to the right of the sergeant, how the shell casings hit you? And
Our mission at that time was to just dig in and wait for the beach forces to chase the Germans out to us so we could kill them as they came up. Well, I was laying to the right of my squad leader, and he was drunk and had his shirt full of whiskey bottles. And he wanted to go out and meet the Germans, and the platoon leader, Spears, told him that we weren't going to do that, and if you reach for that gun, you better use it. And he did reach for the gun, and Spears fired a blast of Tommy gun bullets in his chest, and whiskey bottles and what have you broke. You could hear them break, and then the chaplain came up with the company commander and talked about the situation, and that's all that we know about that.
okay.
One day we had pretty much secured the area, and we were told to dig in and wait for the beach forces that were coming in, that had already come in, to push the Germans to us and to kill them as they came up. Well, I was laying to the right of my squad leader on our stomachs, waiting on these Germans to come up, when he had looked up to the lieutenant in charge and told him, let's go out and get him. What, are you scared or something? And he said, no, our mission is to wait here until they come up here. He says, why, you're afraid, you chicken this and chicken that. And he started to reach for his gun, and the lieutenant told him, he says, if you reach for that gun, you better use it. So I was looking up at the lieutenant, and as this sergeant turned around to more on his back, the lieutenant fired a burst of shells into his chest, and cognac bottles broke, and other whiskey bottles broke, and shells from his Tommy gun were flying everywhere. But later on, Chaplain came up with the company commander, and they talked about the situation, and the chaplain got down and said a few words for the sergeant, and they took him away somewhere, and we just waited to complete our mission that we were put there for.
Now, the first time you told me this story, you said that the lieutenant wiped a tear from his eye and told you to retrieve the dead man's binoculars or compass or whatever was still usable. Could you say that?
After the shooting, the lieutenant asked me to get his binoculars, get his compass, his gun, and what have you, and hold on to him because they were going to give him to somebody else. You know, we had to use that stuff in Normandy, and that's when he went and got the company commander to come back and talk about the situation.
So that it was deemed as a self-defense situation by the company commander, right?
I beg your pardon?
The company commander decided that it was a case of self-defense, and that's why no further consequences came.
Being a private laying down there, I couldn't hear the conversation, but I assumed that they all decided it was a justifiable killing in combat, disobeying a direct order, and that was the end of that.
And your take on it was that you never quarreled with the officers, and the sergeant more or less brought that situation on himself, right?
No question about it. The sergeant was responsible for what happened because he had been warned by the lieutenant not to reach for his gun. And he should have, as a matter of fact, at one point there, the lieutenant had told this sergeant to fall back and go back because you've been drinking too much. And that's when the other words entered the conversation, saying that he was chicken and afraid, and let's go out and get him, and one thing and another.
Now, did you get the feeling at the time that the lieutenant felt bad about what happened, or had any regrets about it? Or,
No. I had talked to the same lieutenant
over 40 years
4,
later.
5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. And I went to his hometown and called him, and he came down and met us where we were at some restaurant, and he remembered me. He said, "Hi, Jumbo, how are you?" And I said, "Hi, Lieutenant, how are you?" And we talked about that situation, and he said, I had to take him out. I had to take him out. And that's about all he had mentioned about that situation.
Okay. Is there anything else from during the war that you think you should tell on here as far as your experiences that you remember?
The experiences were daily. A lot of things happened, and I suppose I had their reputation, as a lot of them did, of being a little bit more aggressive. That's why this lieutenant would like to take me on his patrol trips with him. But every day there were different incidences. There was no end to Normandy or Holland or Bastogne. Something happened every day, every day.
And you feel that even though you've had some pretty traumatic experiences, you don't really dream about it. You don't think it's affected you too much in your life after the war then, huh?
After all I've been through, I can honestly say I don't feel like World War II has affected me as much as some of the other soldiers that I had seen at the VA and up at the Veterans Hospital seem to be suffering from. I don't think at this stage that it has affected me that much at all.
That's just your individual ability to cope with things more so than other people, I think, because you went through probably some of the worst experiences I've heard about, and where it would have bothered other people, it doesn't seem to bother you that much. But you did say earlier tonight when we were talking that you think your experiences were somewhat typical, and that things like this happen in all the companies in the 101st. Maybe you're just more honest in telling about what happened in other people. Think that's possible?
Yes, I think that this was a daily occurrence with everybody that was in the Airborne. They all went through the same thing. Some were able to take the pressure better than others. But Purple Hearts, everybody had 2 or 3 of them. They have gone through that much in Europe, in Holland, and in Bastogne. They all went through the same type of thing. Every day was a big problem.
Well, you said something interesting earlier, that one reason people don't talk about these things is they're ashamed to talk about them now, that because they're different people now than they were when they were 18 years old. And
I think the reason why I myself, I'll use myself as an example, don't talk about the war unless I'm involved with other people that were in the war. I think as they grow older, they begin to feel and realize what death and killing is all about, and they just don't talk about it. And they'd rather not talk about what went on 55 years ago.
they probably don't talk to non-combatants because they figure they wouldn't understand the context that these things happen in also.
No, there's no way. Just recently I was invited to a Chamber of Commerce. They asked me to go talk about D-Day. It was on a June 6th of one year, a couple of years ago. And they asked me to explain the problems and what we went through as paratroopers. And I told them from beginning to end, and there wasn't a noise in the room. You could hear a pin drop. They really didn't believe what I was telling them, because unless you're really there, there's no way that they can comprehend what that is all about. Even after I got through, I thanked them for inviting me, and they asked me questions for a half hour, 45 minutes later. And I had told my wife that I shouldn't have went up there to begin with. You know, tell people about what happened during those years. It's just, unless you're involved in that type of action, people don't understand what you're talking about.
Yeah, you said another interesting thing, that now it even seems unreal to you after 55 years have passed. It seems almost like a dream that these things happen.
Yes, I watched some videos, and I tell my wife, it's hard to believe that I was involved in that type of thing. Maybe I wasn't there. Maybe I just dreamt of all this. And I can't believe in some cases that I actually jumped in Normandy at 2 o'clock in the morning and jumped in Holland and was surrounded in Bastogne and survived 3 wounds. I got 3 Purple Hearts. It's hard to believe that you've been exposed to that type of thing, and even today it's hard to believe.
Now those newer men that came in as replacements late in the war, I gather they really looked up to you in combat, and I guess Tom Sacco's in that category. Is he one of those green replacements you were talking about at Bastogne?
Tom Sacco came in Bastogne. He had never been exposed to that type of life before, and they were all afraid. I can remember one soldier from West Virginia. He had just come into Bastogne, and when we started to move out around the 1st of January of 45, I think it was, that he refused to get out of his hole. He was deathly afraid. And of course I told him I did what the lieutenant did to the sergeant a number of months ago, and I told him, get out of the hole and let's go. We're all afraid, you and me and everybody else. So that got him out of the hole, and we got going.
Were you afraid when these things were happening? That doesn't seem to come through in your stories, but do you remember being afraid? Or?
No, I can't really say I was afraid. I went on a lot of patrols and did a lot of terrible things, and I can't really say that I was afraid during those years.
How about under artillery fire? Some people tell me that's the only time they were really afraid, when they were helpless and the shells were going off all around them. But
there was nothing you could do with artillery fire. All you could do is get down in your hole and say a few good words to the good Lord that you're not hit by artillery fire or shrapnel or something, air bursts and what have you. But as Airborne, we didn't face too much of that, unless...
You never got close to the breaking point there under an artillery barrage where you thought you were going to lose it?
No.
I guess that really bothered some people. Yeah. How about this? Were you afraid of what would happen to you if you were taken prisoner by the Germans? Or?
Never gave it a thought.
Did you have an attitude that you'd go down and fighting rather than ever surrender, that you would never allow them to take you prisoner? Or?
Never gave it a thought.
Okay, because you mentioned seeing some guys that had been burned with flamethrowers when they were hanging in trees, or what are some of the things you saw in Normandy that the Germans did to paratroopers?
Well, unfortunately, a lot of paratroopers made tree landings, and because of the equipment they had on them, somewhere near 100 pounds worth of equipment on them. Landmines and hand grenades and your equipment to make tree landings, and couldn't get out of their harness because we had the old type harness that you had to unbuckle. Now the British had buckles to release their chutes by turning a gadget in front of them and just hitting the gadget, and it would just fall off of them. We didn't have that equipment. Flamethrowers, I've seen Airbornes with flamethrowers that had been put on them and burnt. and of course shot hanging in there. I think that's another point that made the Airborne so deadly, of what he saw happen to his fellow soldier.
You also told me that your temperament was equal to the temperament of the Germans, which made you an equal adversary to them, or something to that effect. Your temperament was to obey commands instantly and to have discipline and all that type of thing.
Well, the airborne troops were all pretty much disciplined. I think they taught us that from jump school. We jump together, we fight together, we cover each other. It's a matter of strict discipline.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to tell on here? Because I'll make you a copy of this for your family. And
well, the only thing I want to say is that, of course, I'm more than happy that I survived all that and I was able to come home. And incidentally, when I was at that Chamber of Commerce meeting, they had asked me about paratroopers and what their reactions were after the war, because Mrs. Roosevelt at one time said that the American Airborne would have to be re-educated. With everything they've been through. But at this meeting, I had told the people that I know of a half a dozen nearby paratroopers that were in our company. They didn't go off the deep end like some of the veterans from Vietnam and what have you. They all married, raised families, worked, bought a house, had automobiles, and none of them ever cracked up and went off the deep end.
one story you told me before was the last time you saw Lieutenant Spears in Europe after the war had ended. And one of you was on a train and the other, I guess you were on the train, and he ran along the siding there saying goodbye to you. Can you tell that story?
I was going to southern France to get aboard ship and come back home, and by this time Lieutenant Spears had been made captain, company commander of another company, and I didn't see him as often as I did before. And I was in this boxcar they used to haul us in, and as the train was pulling out, this Captain Spears ran up alongside the train waving at me, yelling, "I'll see you, Jumbo, I'll see you, Jumbo." And I says, "Take it easy, Captain, take it easy, I'll see you later." And that was the last I had seen him until a few years ago.
I think that was 1988 when you met him for lunch, or that's 11 years ago now. Or at least
Probably
10.
somewhere in there.
It's been about 10 years or so ago.
Time goes by fast, and he stayed in the Army till the 60s sometime, right?
Huh?
He stayed in the Army till...
I pulled 2 hitches.
No, I mean, Spears stayed in it.
Oh yeah, he retired. He was, his last tour of duty was in Berlin, where he was commandant of this prisoner of war camp.
Spandau prison.
Right.
Don't you think it was therapeutic for you to meet with him and find out what his outlook was and his perspective was on all these things that happened during the war?
No, we both had the same mental attitude about the whole thing. One didn't feel differently than the other.
Well, the bottom line was you agreed that you both didn't know if you were going to be alive a few minutes later when all these things were happening. Your whole life expectancy was totally uncertain at the time. But he seemed to have resolved the whole thing, and didn't have any complications about it in his thinking.
That's right. Yeah, there was, he was calm and cool and collective when I met him 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years ago, whatever it was, and the war didn't seem to affect him at all.
Well, yeah, when I first found out where he was, I think I told you I debated for over 6 months whether I should put you in contact with him again, because I didn't know if it would be a positive thing or a negative thing for you. But I'm glad I did now. I'm glad you got to meet with him.
Sure, we got along fine. We had lunch and we talked about certain things, you know, and about the sergeant that was taken out, as he expressed it, and we said goodbye, and he went his way and we went our way.
Well, I'm glad you got to meet him at least once, because he never comes to reunions. He's never been to a one.
Never been to one, never seen him. No.
I know when I first met you, you and Truex were speculating on where was he and why hadn't you ever seen him since the war, so...
I don't know where I got his address in California.
Well, I found him and I called you with it, but
okay.
I didn't know if I should do that or not.
Yes, I'm glad you did. I'm glad you did. He was a close companion, a good combat companion. Although he took a lot more risks than an average person would. He was a killer. That guy was a killer.
And you said that you're glad he was on your side, right?
Yeah, I'm glad he was an American paratrooper. I think, and it was a story that he was a British commando before he became an American paratrooper.
I know he married an English girl.
But he was a tough soldier. No question about it. In Normandy, one of my friends that lives in Youngstown, Ohio, had his helmet shot off his head, and I was across the road maybe 25, 30, 40 feet away from him, and he said, "Hey Jumbo, get my helmet, throw my helmet to me." I said, "Are you crazy?" So there's landmines everywhere in these ditches, and he got upset and stood straight up and walked right through all those mines, got his helmet, put his helmet back in his hand, walked back to where he was and lay down there. And he never did forgive me for that.
So he was still mad at you after the war for that one, huh?
Yeah, he never would forgive me for that. But I wasn't about to get up and walk through that minefield just to get his helmet for him.
So you couldn't have just reached out and got it. You would have had to walk and get it.
I had to go across the road and get it and
so really,
give it to him. Yeah.
It really wasn't fair of him to ask you to do it in the first place, huh?
It was fair for him, not for me though.
Okay.